There is actually additional effects that can happen when you're taking flash photos. So as you remember, I mentioned that there's two curtains that basically open and then close in succession in order to show light or to allow light to enter into the sensor or the film. So if we have a relatively long shutter speed, so maybe one that's slightly longer than the sync speed, for example, so that means that the first curtain opens and it stays open for some amount of time, then the next shutter closes, we can actually have two different periods of time when the flash can fire. And each one will produce a different result. So in this case, we can combine this sort of motion blur with a still object and realize that all that's happening in these two photos is that we have a somewhat long shutter speed and there's a flash firing somewhere in the middle. And what's happening is that if we let's say we open the first curtain and we fire the flash and then we wait a little bit of time and then we close the second curtain, what might happen if we have this sort of bright light that's zooming by, as would be the case on this motorcycle? So we would actually get this first image that's on the left here, where we have very quickly opened the first curtain and fired the flash, which means that we have frozen this exact moment in time. But as we've kept the shutter open for a little bit longer, that means that that motorcycle was able to move off screen or off image, and therefore you get this sort of, it looks like he's reversing, but he's not. This is actually a first curtain sync, what's called a first curtain sync, because the camera is synchronizing the exact moment when the first curtain opens, then it fires the flash, and then it waits just a little bit of time in order to close the second curtain. Was there a question?
Yeah, why is the streak only of the light and not of the object also?
Why is the streak only of the light and not of the object also? Because the rest of the object is too dark to be visible for these particular exposure settings. So only the light is bright enough to register through whatever f-stop and ISO settings they had used in this particular case. It would require a higher ISO or a lower f number to try to get the rest of the object visible in this particular case. Now that's just this particular example. It is possible if you have even lighting to get the same sort of effect with the object as a whole, but in this case it was just exaggerated using this extra bright light, the brake light that's on this motorcycle, to exaggerate this particular effect of shutter speed, or rather of curtain sync. So I know it's, let's see. So just keep in mind that the rest of this object is very, very dark, because remember what you are seeing is the illuminated object from the flash only, and other times it's just too dark to register for the sensor for the sensor to register that particular object. You can only see, so to speak, the light that is bright enough for it to register. Okay, so we also then have a rear curtain sync, or a second curtain sync, where we open the shutter. So the first curtain opens, and then we have some amount of time where that shutter is completely open, and then we fire the flash and then close the second shutter, or the second curtain immediately. And that is this result here. So that's because after we open the first curtain, we are allowing motion blur to happen. So this motorcycle has moved into the image. Then, right when we're about to close the shutter, we fire the flash. And as we fire the flash, we get that object at the very end of its motion, and then we close the curtain. So all the difference here is when the flash is firing. So if we fire the flash first and allow the object to move, then we're going to make it look like it's moving in reverse, just because this flash is fired and then the motorcycle has moved on. But if we fire the flash last, then the motion will move to wherever it is, the flash will fire, and then that's where we will see the result. So if you want to get a photo that's like this, where you have to have a slow curtain sync, and in other words, you have a long shutter speed with some amount of light in the in the scene and you need to illuminate that or provide additional illumination with a flash, then most of the time you will probably want to use a second curtain sync or a rear curtain sync. Yes?
Shouldn't the license plate not have a trail on it though? The second one?
The license plate, yes, so this question was, shouldn't the license plate not have a trail on the second one? So presumably there is additional illumination happening here. So license plates are usually pretty reflective, so there could be additional light that's off camera to the left maybe that's providing some additional illumination. If you look closely, you do also see that same trail in this first photo as well. So it's not a trick of the flash or anything like that. It's just more prominent in this particular case, but there is something that's illuminating that license plate more than the rest of the motorcycle, whether that's the lights that are built into it or it's reflecting additional light that's off camera. It's tough to tell, but it's probably a combination of both. Okay, any other questions about curtain sync? All right, so yes, you can imagine that there's even more stuff that we can do with flash, and that is that if you have relatively long shutter speed and you take multiple flash, you can get this sort of stroboscopic effect. So you can have this effect where if you have, even for a split second where somebody is hitting a tennis ball with a tennis racket, and this again is a photo by Dr. Edgerton. He was sort of the master of flash photography, especially early on. This particular photo was from 1949. But anyway, if you have a flash that's capable of producing many unique or many individual flashes in a burst of sorts, so it just very quickly is flashing like this, then you can get this sort of effect here where you can stop motion of a particular object throughout its motion range. So you just are firing this flash multiple times very, very, very quickly. And usually we don't get this sort of effect in sort of our day-to-day flash units, but higher-end flash units will typically have this sort of capability for you to take a photo just like this. So, what even common flash units have, particularly ones that are from specific manufacturers. So if you have a Canon camera or you have a Nikon camera and you buy a flash unit that's specific to that particular format, then they usually have what's called a high-speed sync option. And so for all of my talk of being unable to take a photo at a shutter speed that is faster than your X sync speed, what these flashes can actually do is an effect that's similar to this. So it fires multiple times very, very quickly, but it just puts these flashes closer together so that it's a longer amount of time that this flash is outputting light. Then that means that then we can have a faster shutter speed because then we don't have this problem with curtains getting in the way, etc. And we can use what's called a high sync speed to try to take a photo that is faster than our fastest X sync speed. So this, and again, this is not meant to be confusing. You might say, well, why do we need a longer amount of flash if we're going to get a faster shutter speed? And remember that if by going back a little bit and looking again at this, as soon as we get any shutter speed that is faster than this X sync speed, we're at a specific moment in time, some portion of the image is actually going to be blocked off. So in order for us to make sure that we get the entire thing properly exposed, we have to make sure that the flash lasts for the duration of the time that those curtains are moving across. And so that's why we need a slightly longer time in what high-end flashes are capable of doing. But you don't need a high-end flash to take flash photos, to do a lot of the things that you need. In fact, this one, I don't even know how old this is, but this is an old Vivitar 3500. I think it's at least probably 15 or 20 years old now. It's pretty ancient, but you can use these old flashes on your new cameras. So for example, this Vivitar, let's see, this was a 283. These old Vivitar 283s were actually very, very popular with hobbyists that take photos, that take digital photos, and want to have the sort of manual control over them. So when you're taking photos on your digital camera with a flash that's like this, then generally what you will do is set your camera at the X sync speed, because that's the fastest shutter speed you can take it at. Then you have to just sort of you have to look at the guide number, and usually there's a little bit of a graph back here that helps you figure out, okay, this flash has this much power and I'm using these settings, and so I can therefore take a photo that's this far away. And then you can use an older flash unit in sort of a manual fashion on your digital camera. Now there's something that you have to watch out for, and that is that these older flashes, they have electrical contacts here on what's called the hot shoe mount, and that's just the mount that attaches the flash to the top of the camera. It's a very common mount, and you've probably seen it before. But the older flashes can have very, very high voltages across those contacts that can damage modern digital cameras. So before you use any old flash on your camera, I recommend that you actually take a look at one particular website that has compiled a lot of information about old flashes, and it will actually tell you the voltage. And usually usually having a flash that is capable of a voltage of about 6 volts or less is safe to use on your camera. So anyway, there's this big table where they have a variety of flash manufacturers and flash models, and they tell you whether or not it is safe to use on a typical digital camera. And in fact, this is something, if you're electrically inclined, this is something you can test yourself by turning on your flash unit, waiting for it to charge up, using a voltmeter to determine the volts across the electrical contacts. And if it is higher than about 5 or 6 volts, then I recommend not using it on your digital camera unless you're absolutely sure that it is capable of supporting that high of a voltage. But anyway, I'll post a link to this off of the lectures page, because this is something that is probably useful and certainly interesting to know. And I don't want any of you frying your camera, because I recommend using an old flash. But anyway, with these old flashes, what's really neat about them is that you can get some relatively inexpensive equipment to actually move it off of the camera. So this flash does have a very typical hot shoe mount where I could mount it on top of the camera and use it there, but that doesn't offer a lot of interesting ways that I can use this flash. By using what's called a PC cord, and only a few SLRs have this, you'll have to make sure that yours supports it. You can use what's called a PC cord to connect to a flash unit like this, and then you can just have like a separate light stand for it, for example, and move the flash off camera. So now you can get interesting angles out of this light. You can do interesting things with this light that just was not possible by having it mounted purely on your camera. If you're interested in this sort of thing, there's a website, or it's really rather a blog, but it's a website that has gained quite a bit of popularity called Strobist. And these people, it may actually be just a couple of people that manage this, but they have quite a following. But most of these people use digital cameras with manual flashes like this, in very much an off-camera situation, to take some absolutely stunning photos that just are not possible otherwise. So that one's not, it's a YouTube video, so it's not terribly great, but just photos that you would not normally expect. Oh, come on, give me one. So something like this, for example. This one is pretty neat, of the shuttle taking off back in September 18th, it looks like, and how these people have actually taken photos that look like this using just a couple of off-camera flashes and their digital camera. And so this is something that's very neat and definitely worth exploring. Now, you can use flashes for more than just really creative outlets. They can actually be extremely useful, if it's going to come up, to enhance the amount of light that exists within a scene. So let's say that you are taking a photo of a scene and you have very harsh lighting, or it's somewhat heavily backlit, and you need to provide additional illumination to a subject that is reasonably close to you. Then in this case, it's usually okay to use the flash that exists on your camera to provide additional illumination. So in this case, you can more evenly light portions of the image just because of their proximity. So in this case, this was a perfect candidate for additional fill flash because the object was relatively close, it was backlit, and you can use it to just make sure that you get a very even amount of light that exists. Because while in software you can later go back and fix something that looks like this, it's going to be a lot more difficult. The downside, obviously, is that you will get these same sorts of problems that exist before, such as harsh flash reflections that can exist. And so you'll have to be careful with that particular aspect of it. But using fill flash is really, really vital and really important to be able to get properly exposed photographs sort of in the midday when there's very harsh lighting and there's going to be very harsh shadows. So in this particular case, the sun, as you can see, was providing some very harsh light, but by adding some fill flash, you can remove a lot of those harsh shadows that exist on a subject's face and make it a lot more even, so that you can get some much more evenly lit photographs. And so remember here, of course, that you have to be careful with light fall off, because the subject does have to be within a certain range in order for you to be able to fill, to provide enough light to fill the darker regions with fill flash appropriately. But one of the things that you may find is an even bigger hindrance to fill flash is that X sync speed. So remember that I said that the maximum speed that you can use when taking a flash photo is about 1/250th of a second. And that's a big problem when you're taking a photograph during the daytime, because something that's as bright as this is going to be very difficult. You're going to have to really use some high F numbers and some low ISOs to try to get the exposure values to fit within the sync speed. And in this case, I had to make the F number F11 and make the ISO 100 in order to be able to make the camera have a slow enough shutter speed at 1/250th of a second. So this is where having an additional level of or additional speed for the sync speed can become quite handy, because then you were able to take a photo in the daylight and use fill flash a lot more effectively. And so this is something that you really do have to be careful with. So flash photography is something that's really useful. You can use it, as I mentioned, for fill flash. You can use it for providing additional light for subjects. And one of the things I really recommend once you move beyond this class, because we don't really focus on it too much in the assignments, is that you work on using some off-camera lighting on your flash, because it really provides this additional level of control to your scenes that you just have not had before. But also, it gives this extra dimension. So I mentioned all of this. I mentioned before that I had this stigma against using flash lighting for a long time, because it was very harsh, it's very unnatural. But by moving the camera by moving the flash off of the camera, you have so much additional control over it that it really becomes quite acceptable and really quite fun to be able to light objects with just a flash. And you can do some really amazing things with off-camera flash. And again, you don't have to purchase anything, but if you're interested in this, look at that Strobist website. Again, I'll post a link to it online. But just with a couple of relatively inexpensive cords and adapters, you can get even a normal flash like this to be able to be used off camera. And just so that it's clear, this cord will actually control the flash, and more specifically, it'll fire the flash off camera, so that when I take a photo using the camera, then it will fire the flash elsewhere. And this can be really useful and really quite fun. But that's it for flash, and I look forward to seeing you next week when we continue talking about digital photography.